Thank you everyone for coming to our talk on localizing neutrality violation. So this is a joint work with my colleagues, Mohammed and Pavlo, and under the supervision of my advisor, Katerina, and in collaboration with David and Philippa. So in this talk, I will be telling you about the principle of net neutrality and how we can identify ISPs that violate the neutrality principle. So let's just start with the following example. Okay, yeah. So imagine the following example: you watching Netflix video as normal, but your video keeps on loading slowly. So you assume that your internet connection is slow. And if you know about MLab speed test, you go and you do a speed test and you realize that your internet speed is normal. So you open a different platform, you watch a video there, and that one is loading normally. So you draw a conclusion that Netflix servers are experiencing a problem. While that can be true, there could be another reason why you're having this different experience with these two different platforms. And that is because somewhere out there, some ISP who's responsible to forward the traffic coming from the different content provider to your tablet does not have the same treatment for the traffic based on the content application, the content provider they belong to, and as a result, you have different performance. So let me elaborate more about this. Ideally, an ISP, when it receives traffic that are coming from different content, it processes all of them together in a single entity, one queue, one link. That's a neutral scenario. In a non-neutral scenario, what an ISP can do is that he can have a dedicated resource, which could be a queue or link, that will handle only the traffic that is coming from Netflix. Now, that resource is configured to either favor the traffic that is coming from Netflix or discriminate against the traffic that is coming from Netflix. And the result of that is that Netflix traffic experience higher loss and or delay. These actions are referred to as traffic throttling. And for the rest of this talk, I will focus on one practice of traffic throttling, which is policing, and that is the one that targets experiencing higher loss. But all of our work works also on delay. So why would an ISP do that? What is the incentives of having this dedicated queue or link? The first incentive is paid prioritization. So basically what the ISP does is that it allocates resources to the content providers that are willing to pay for that and can in return slow down other services to discourage the customers from using them. One compelling example I found was this headline from Ars Technica, where Netflix have announced that the net neutrality battle is no longer their battle because now Netflix is big enough to pay for the resources they need and get the good deals out of it. So this just demonstrates that the internet market is no longer a fair, or can no longer be a fair platform where all startups and innovative ideas can use. So imagine someone out there in their dorm came up with a better version of Netflix, but cannot fairly compete with Netflix just because they don't have the resources for that. The second reason or incentive is managing network congestion. So an ISP might be overloaded with the traffic that is coming from a certain content provider. And last year, there was this incident where the South Korean ISP have actually sued Netflix for a sudden surge they experienced when the Squad Game was released. And they claimed that Netflix needs to pay them for the maintenance work they had to do back then. So in this situation, an ISP might find itself in a position that it have to restrict the bandwidth of some application in order to provide good services for the other. So the actual problem lies with the fact that some of these ISPs are not transparent about the traffic management practices they have out there, and they hide what they're doing. And internet users have the right to know what is being deployed out there. First, in order to make informative decision about which ISPs they would like to register with, and two, to be involved in the net neutrality battle and have an influence on what net neutrality rules need to be out there. So now that I explained to you what a neutrality violation is, I will first show you some background about WIHI, which is an application out there that detects neutrality violation. And then after that, I will explain to you our solution to be built on top of WIHI that can detect if the violation detected by WIHI belongs to the access ISP. So WIHI is an application. It's hosted in AmLab, and you can find it on the Play Store. And assume you want to check if your Netflix traffic is being throttled. So you download this application on your phone or tablet, and you press a button for Netflix. And what WIHI does at that moment, it connects you to a server. It then sends from that server some random traffic it knows ISPs cannot recognize. After that, it sends pre-recorded traces of application traffic. And once it's done, if the throughput of these two different traffic is significantly different, then WIHI reports that there is a violation. But WIHI can only detect a violation. So what is still missing? On the path from your phone to that server, you have first the access ISP. Those are the ISPs that, those are basically the companies we pay for in order to get our internet subscription from. And you have other ISPs along the way that are responsible only to forward this traffic. Now, some people argue that when a violation is detected, it's the access ISP to have the highest incentive to do so. But without enough evidence, such accusation cannot be held, and the access ISP can still argue that the problem or the output of WIHI is due to some network performance that condition that happen outside of their infrastructure, or they can try to justify that some other ISPs have the incentive to do this. And that is exactly where we come in. So it's hard to tell where is the problem. And our project is basically to tell you if a violation is detected, the access ISP is the one to be held responsible for that. Now, with one single path, we cannot do this. So what do we need? We need two paths. We need a path pair. And we need to make sure that the path pair have one intersection point, so that if that point, so that's the brown part in the picture, so if that brown part have a problem, the two paths from the server to the phone will observe this problem. And this kind of topology, we call them Y-shaped topologies, and the Y-shaped topologies helps us observe a common problem. An extra thing, the brown part, the common part, needs to be inside of the access ISP, and only inside of the access ISP, so that if we detect a common problem and we blame it on the common part, the only one to be held accountable for it is the access ISP, because this is part of its infrastructure. Okay, so now that I showed you what kind of topologies that we need, I will illustrate what is the test that we do in order to find if the brown part if the violation is listed at the brown part. So we have a multiple step test. The first step we do is we reuse WIHI. So we do the same thing as WIHI does, but now on both paths. We send first the random traffic. We then send the application traffic. We apply WIHI's detection method. And based on the output of WIHI for the two paths, we draw a conclusion. So let's start with the first case. The case where WIHI tells us path 1 experienced no throttling, while path 2 experienced throttling. This is a very easy case because it's definitely in the non-common part, in the orange part of the network, because if it to be in the brown part, then both paths needs to be throttled. So once we see this case, we do not need to go further, and we stop and we draw a conclusion. But now, what if his output tell us both paths have a violation? The first logical thing that someone would think of, okay, then this means that it's the common part. We found it. Remember, our goal is that we need to hold the strongest evidence that the access ISP is to be responsible for this part, and we don't want to leave any loophole. So if we do draw conclusion at this moment, someone might argue, but it could be, it's low chances, but it could be that the non-common parts of the network were the parts that are responsible for what we observed. So given that, we need an extra test that can detect that the violation is on the common link. So what do? We use the fact that he told us there is a polyser. So Netflix traffic have worse performance from the non-Netflix traffic. And we use the loss measurements that we get from the both servers, the path loss measurements. And we try to search for what we call performance correlation. So what is correlation? Imagine the polyser was at the common link of the network, and the two servers sends a packet. Back then, the queue was not full. Then the two servers sent another packet, but the queue was full at that moment. The two packets will observe the same overflow event and will lose packet at the end. So paths that go through the same polyser experience correlated loss or delay, which is congestion. Now, a side note here, away from the some ISPs, they have an extra practice that they do where they do the throttling per TCP connection. So they have one queue for each TCP connection. Now, what I've showed you so far is that the two packets saw the same overflow event in that queue. So in the case of per connection policing, we cannot apply our method the same way we're applying it now. And there is an ongoing work on that part where we're trying to extend our current method to account for that. Now, back to the actual presentation. So let's take the second scenario we showed earlier. What if the policers were on the outside? So this means, and it happened because these two parts of the network, they have different cross traffic. So the server one, the policer on server one is full, but the second one is not. So when the server sends a packet, packet one will be lost, while packet two will not be lost. So there is no correlated congestion in this case. Now, does this mean that when the policer are on the non-common link, I do not observe correlated congestion? Not really. It could happen that during the test, the common link have experienced temporary congestion because of normal conditions. And that two servers sent the packet at that moment, and they both saw the packet loss, and they got lost. So paths can still experience correlated congestion even in absence of common policer. So we need one more information. What is this information? We use the behavior of policer as an extra information. Let me illustrate more. What a policer does is that it receives aggregate traffic coming from different places, and it tries to limit the rate of that traffic. As a result of that limiting, packets will experience high loss. So a policer is usually responsible for the majority of the loss that the traffic will experience. So if we mix the idea that loss that for a common policer, congestion is correlated, and a policer needs to cause the high congestion, that is as if we're saying that the traffic that is coming from the two paths will experience a common bottleneck. And that's how we map a problem. We go from localizing a violation to identifying a common bottleneck. So how do we identify a common bottleneck? The logic is as follows. If there's a bottleneck, if the brown part is the bottleneck, the brown part needs to be more often congested than the other parts. And that's what we use, but we reverse it a little bit. So if the probability that the common part is not congested, and I will illustrate later why we're using not congested instead of congested, is less than the probability that the non-common part is not congested, for both paths, that means that the brown part is a common bottleneck. So I'm saying nothing but that the common part need to be less often not congested than the rest of the network. So now to answer the question that I'm sure everyone is thinking about, why am I talking about the links when I don't have access to how links perform? Otherwise, our problem would be very easy. But we only have access to how the paths performs. That is where tomography comes in. So tomography is an algorithm out there, and tomography tells us that if you know how often these paths are not congested, which is congestion free, and how often these paths are not congested at the same time, so they are congestion free at the same time, you can infer how often the links are congestion free. And you do this by simply solving a system of equations. So informally, what the system of equations says. The first two equations says nothing but when a path is good, all the links on the path is good. So imagine you send a packet. If a packet didn't get lost, then it's impossible that any of the link lost the packet. And that is exactly why we're using not congested. So if the path didn't experience any congestion, none of the links will experience congestion. The last equation is basically what holds the correlation. The last equation says if the path pair are good, so then all the parts of the network are good. And that's the insight for that. So if we group everything we've said so far, we come up with this basic algorithm. The first step is, given the loss measurements, we compute the probabilities that the path and the path pair are congestion free. Now, what does it mean probability congestion free in practical terms? It's nothing but saying that the paths experience packet loss that is below a certain threshold. And that threshold is something that we determined and we set. So how we do this computation? We take the trace, the traffic over duration d. We divide the time into intervals of sizes s and in each interval we compute the loss ratio. When we compare the loss ratios to the threshold, we get the state of the path, whether it's congested or not. So 1 is not congested and 0 is congested. And now the path pair, remember, it means that it's good at the same time. So it's nothing but the AND operation between the path's congestion state. And by taking the average, we get the probabilities that we need, and which will be an input to the tomography system we just represented. So once we have these probabilities, we apply tomography, the same thing we explained. Once we apply tomography, we get how the links perform. So we get the congestion-free probabilities of the links. The last step would be to look for a common bottleneck. And that means that path 1 needs to be bottlenecked at the common link, and path 2 needs to be bottlenecked at the common link. And here we only do the comparison that we discussed before. So XC, the probability of the common link, should be worse than the probability of the non-common parts. And then the output at the end would be say whether we have a common polycer or we have no evidence. So this looks straightforward. I thought exactly the same when I started on the problem, and probably that's why I started working on the problem. But it turns out it is not that easy. And the reason why it's not that easy is because on the internet, in reality and practice, correlations are not easy to have and find. And the reason for that is three main challenges. The TCP dynamics, the fact that TCP reacts to network conditions and sends in a different manner than how you set it. The second thing is how accurate we are with the loss ratios we compute and how accurate we are with the probabilities we compute. So I'm going to talk about each one of them separately. So first of all, TCP. Now, UDP is usually an easy case. UDP, you send traffic and they reach the polyser at almost relatively common time and they go through it. But in TCP, according to the network condition, so according to network delay and congestion, it can end up sending the packets in different times, despite our effort to try to make them go to the network at the same time. Now, as a result, if the polyser, if the queue of the polyser is full, one of the paths will see a loss event that the other didn't. So packets can experience uncorrelated congestion even in the presence of a common polyser. The impact of this is on the next challenges, and I will talk about how we mitigate that effect later on. There is another problem with TCP, is that TCP, when it needs to send, it can send sometimes in bursts. So if one path saw loss, it will back off and send one packet, while the other will keep on sending multiple packets altogether. So as a result of that, the queue, when they reach the queue, one path might experience bursty loss, which can introduce noise to our measurements. So TCP creates bursty traffic. Now, we've seen better results when enabling TCP pacing. So TCP pacing helped reduce the traffic burstiness, but the impact remained on the accuracy of the measurements. So we tackle them next on in the next slides. So challenge number 2 is how accurate we compute the loss ratios. Recall how we compute loss ratios. We divide time into intervals. Now, you have an interval size. How do you determine the interval size? So when selecting an interval size, we need to be careful about it because we can fall in one of these two risks. The first one is assume we send the packets and these two packets got lost because of the same congestion event. But I set my interval size too small that these two packets were in separate intervals. And my judgment here will be, oh, in interval 1, path 1 was congested while path 2 wasn't. And interval 2, path 2 was congested while path 1 wasn't. And this will lead to uncorrelated behavior. Risk number 2 is that I could have packets lost because of uncorrelated, due to non-common reasons. So for example, the polyser is on the non-common link. But I used a big interval where all the packets were in one interval. Now, if I to make the judgment here, I would say, okay, path 1 and path 2 are congested in the same interval. That's false correlation. So we cannot draw the conclusion based on one single interval size. And this is why we use multiple interval sizes and we select them as multiples of RTTs. Okay, now the last part, the last challenge is when we compute the probabilities. So we have our loss ratios, but then we come to compute the probabilities and we compare them to a threshold. But that threshold is another parameter that can be that is sensitive, and we need to select it properly to not fall with a false conclusion. So what could happen there? Assume we'll focus for now on one interval. So assume in this interval the loss ratio of path 1 was 0.2, while path 2 was 0.05. So clearly, path 1 is more congested than path 2. And the underground should be that there is no correlated congestion. But it happened, I selected my threshold too low, and I assume that both of them are congested. So that's a false detected correlation, which can lead to false accusation of the access ISP. Let's reuse them and go to the other extreme. What if my threshold was higher than these ratios? My judgment will be there is no problem. And in this case, I will fail to detect the violation in the first place. There's one last risk. Assume now the loss ratios change. So now the loss ratios are 0.12 and 0.1. These are loss ratios that are close to each other. So most probably that here there was a correlated congestion, and I need to capture that. But my threshold was kind of sensitive that it was in between these two, that I came up with the fact that one is congested, the other isn't. And in this case, I failed to detect the correlation. So because of that, we cannot draw also conclusion based on one threshold, because if we select it wrongly, that can lead us to completely wrong conclusion. And this is why we need multiple thresholds. And the way we select the threshold is nothing but we bring all the loss ratios that are computed from previous step, and we select from them. Okay? So now that we explained the challenges, how does our final approach look like? So we tried different methods to mitigate these challenges. And the best approach was actually a heuristic approach. So in the final approach, what we do is, once we get our measurements, we look at the RTTs. From the RTTs, we select multiple interval sizes. And then for each interval size, we go compute the loss ratios. From these loss ratios, we select multiple thresholds. Then we apply our basic algorithm on each one of these combinations. Once we have all these, we aggregate them all together by taking an average, and we check whether our statements, our initial statement that path 1 is bottlenecked at the common link and path 2 is not bottlenecked at the common link, hold. And if they hold, then this means that the polisser was at the access ISP, and that's where I report that the problem is at the access ISP. So I would like to note something here. Why are we able to take this average? Unlike traditional tomography, we're not really interested in how accurate we are with inferring the performance of this path. We're interested in how accurate we are in detecting common congestion correlation between these two paths. So because of that, we use the combination of multiple parameters, and we try to see whether we can find this correlation in any of them. So that is the main reason why our method works. So finally, evaluation. For our evaluation, so based on what we talked so far, we have two parts. One part is finding topologies, and second part is assessing our algorithm. So our first evaluation is, can we find these Y-shaped topologies on the internet? To do so, what we did is we implemented a process which we call topology finder. And what that process does is it goes to AmLab's traceroute database, which are collected from entity users. It fetches these databases, these traceroutes, process them, and output all the possible topologies out there, and then store them in a topology database, which is used later on by our algorithm to perform a test. With 1 week of AmLab traceroute, we found many of these topologies and across all continents. Now, the second part of the evaluation is our algorithm. So can we correctly identify a common bottleneck? To do that, we use simulation. We use an S3 simulator. And we simulated various conditions, various network conditions, different RTD, different levels of congestion. And we configured the polisser to have different levels of throttling. And in each one of these, we did two scenarios. One scenario, we placed the polisser on the common link. And if we fail to detect that, that is a false negative. In another scenario, we place the polisser on the non-common part of the network. And in this case, if we falsely say that there is a common bottleneck, that's a false positive. We used continuous TCP flow in our simulation, and we run the experiment to different durations, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, and 90 seconds. And in all of these, we didn't find any false positive, which is a good thing. As for the false positive, we had a low false positive, as a false negative, we had low false negative, around 8%. And the rate keeps on reducing as we increase the duration, which is reasonable, because as we have more measurement, the more accurate we are in computing the loss ratios and the probabilities. So this brings us to the end of the talk. We told you, we explained to you what is net neutrality, and we've shown that neutrality violations that are detected by WIHI can be attributed to the access ISP when we have the proper wide topology, and through processing the collected end-to-end measurements to identify a common bottleneck. We have also noted that we identify the common bottleneck using tomography. And the main reason we're able to use tomography is that we're interested in capturing the correlation, which tomography does for us, without accurate estimation of the link's performance. So thank you very much for listening. I will be more than happy to take your questions.